Hello everyone, welcome to today's lecture on International Monetary System. In our previous lecture, we discussed foreign exchange markets. We discussed what foreign exchange market is and how it operates. Along with that, we covered the different types of exchanges including spot exchange, forward exchange, and the currency swapping concept. With that, we will move forward to today's lecture, which is based on understanding the arrangement of international monetary system and how international monetary systems are functioning. We will also discuss the history and previous arrangements between different countries. Along with that, we will try to develop and understand what is the role of different financial institutions. We will compare the differences between different exchange rate systems that are actually in practice these days. So these were some of the objectives and background of today's lecture. To begin with, we have to understand first what is the international monetary system. The international monetary system refers to the institutional arrangements that govern exchange rate. Now, the institutional arrangements are referring to those markets and systems where they determine the exchange rate and the impersonal market forces behind the demand and supply between the currencies of two different countries. This means that there is a mechanism which is operating throughout the world. That system is basically trying to identify the exchange rate between the currencies, and it is also governing and controlling the mechanism of different currencies for the betterment of trade and international business. Now, in order to understand the international monetary system, how does the money circulates, how we determine the exchange rate, the price of one currency against the other one, we need to understand the different types of arrangements that are in practice these days. The first among them is called a floating exchange rate. When a foreign exchange market determine the relative value of the currency, we refer to it as a floating exchange rate. Now, floating exchange rate is basically based on the four major currencies of the world, which includes US dollar, euro, yen, Japanese yen, and British pound. These all currencies are free to float against each other. Their exchange rates are determined by the market forces and fluctuate against each other day by day, if not by minute. It is because these currencies have an international reputation which is based on its acceptance for trade throughout the world. Now, the floating exchange rate is based on the demand and supply of the market. Based on the demand and supply in the market, the exchange rate is determined, and it is the market forces that is actually determining what would be the exchange rate of that specific currency against your currency. However, the exchange rate of many currencies are not determined by the free play of market forces, and there are some other arrangements adopted as well. Before proceeding to the other arrangements, we have to understand this thing that if you people remember the recent agreement between IMF and Pakistani government for the loan, in which they asked and forced Pakistani government not to fix the exchange rate, or the state bank should not be forcing or fixing the dollar or other currencies rate, and it should be based on free flow. There, IMF was referring to floating exchange rate, that let the market factors, which is basically the demand and supply of specific currency in the market or in the country, should determine the rate of the your currency against the other currency. So floating exchange rate, in this there is no government interventions as such, and it is free to float against other currencies, and the market determines its own price. When the currency is not floating freely, or the exchange rate is not determined by the market forces, then there within the country there are some institutional arrangements where they fix the currency value. Now, how they fix it, let us discuss and understand it here. Pledge currency or pledge exchange rate. Pledge refers to fixing or securing something. This is where one country is basically trying to fix its currencies relative to the other reference currency. This, for example, mean that Pakistani rupee should be equal to $1 should be equal to 100 rupees Pakistani. This means that the government or the institutions within the country are pledging or fixing the exchange rate of one currency with reference to the other currency. This is done previously in Pakistan as well, where for a particular period of time the rate of dollar conversion was fixed on rupees 100, and later on was fixed on 113 and 115 and so on. This pledging is not based on the free float or the market forces where the demand and supply is determining the price of a specific currency. Rather, the government intervenes into the market and they pledge or fix the currency price as they may feel so. Most of the countries try to pledge their currencies based on the renowned currencies in the world. For example, to US dollar, to euro, pound sterlings, or any other currency in the world which is strong and acceptable. This means that for example, the US dollar and the exchange rate between that currency and other currencies is determined by the reference currency exchange rate. Let's suppose we state that in Pakistan and we pledge that Pakistani currency is equal to 100 rupees for 1 US dollar. Now, all the other currencies rates would be pledged and fixed accordingly based on the reference price. Whatever is the exchange rate between the other currencies and US dollar, same will apply to the Pakistani rupee as well. for example, we have fixed the rate of dollar, that is $1 is equal to 100 rupees, and let's suppose 1 pound British pound sterling is of 1.5 US dollar, then it will automatically be of 150 rupees in Pakistan. Why? Because we pegged to US dollar. We Historical perspective is very important to understand, because it gives us a clear image that how the civilization has progressed and how this international monetary system has been established. Now we all know about barter trade, so I'm not going to discuss it in detail. However, the point to know and understand over here is that after the barter trade, the producers used to trade between gold and silver against their specific products, and there were gold and silver coins as well. Now, using them for a trade within the country is very simplest task. However, when it comes towards the trade between the countries as an international trade, it becomes very difficult. For example, Japan produced a product and they are sending it to US, to their US customers. Now the USA, against the products that they received from Japan, will pay gold or in silver, mostly in gold. Now transferring that specific amount of a gold is a very difficult task, because the international trade was expanding, there was an industrial revolution, and it was very difficult and becoming more impractical to trade with gold. Somehow it was also one of the concern for the countries, because the gold and silver was moving out of their country, which is considered as one of the most important element for their survival and in their system. So they came up with a gold standard. Now, in the gold standard, what they did is that they did arrangement in such a mechanism where all the nations or all the trading countries decided their currency, which was a paper currency, and decided its price or value in terms of reference to the gold. So you can say that they were basically pledging or fixing their currency, that was the paper currency price, and its value worth in gold as well. As an example, this particular gold standard refers to a system in which countries pledge currencies to gold, guarantee their convertibility. This gave an ease to all the governments and the traders, because now they will not be trading directly in gold, rather the currency, which is a paper currency, which is going to be acceptable to them, and they can now trade in that particular currency, because at the back of that currency there is a gold or at least a value to it. So the gold par value refers to the amount of currencies needed to purchase 1 ounce of gold. This was a value given to that specific currency in terms of other. As an example, 1 US dollar was fixed against 23.22 grains of pure gold. This means that whosoever holds 1 US dollar, actually he or she is holding it a value of 23.22 US US gold value. Now, this indicates that if we convert it to the actual value of the gold, so in this case 20.67 US dollars were equal to 1 ounce of gold. And the similar practices were carried out by the UK, by Germany, Japan, and other countries as well. So the amount of currencies needed to purchase 1 ounce of gold was referred to as a gold par value. Now, in British pound was valued at 113 grains of fine or pure gold. This indicates that 4.25 pounds, if you have, is equal to 1 ounce of a gold. That was a par value. Now through this, it was the first time when we got the exchange rate conversion between the US pound and UK, Great Britain's pound sterling as well, where 1 pound was equal to 4.87 US dollar, and similar was in practice in the other countries as well. It gave us a gold standard which contained a powerful mechanism, and it was to bring equilibrium between all the countries, and the balance was ensured. A country was said to be in a balance of equilibrium when the income of its residents earned from export is equal to the money of its resident pay to the other countries for import. So suppose there are only two countries in the world, Japan and US, that we already gave an example. Now imagine Japan trade's balance is in surplus because of its exports more than more to the US than its imports from the United States. Now, the Japanese exporters are paid in US dollar, which are exchanged for Japanese yen at the Japanese bank. The Japanese bank submits the dollar to US government and demands payment of a gold in return. Under the gold standard, when the Japanese were in a trade surplus, there is a net flow of gold from the United States to Japan. These golds flow automatically reduce the money supply, and it increases the Japanese money supply. Now, in order to make sure that the rise of the price of Japanese gold would decrease the demand for these goods, and while the fall in the price of a US goods will increase the demand of these goods, thus the Japanese will start to buy more from US, and United States will buy less from Japan until the balance of trade equilibrium is achieved. It was a trend previously as well that the country who is high in their exports and low in their imports, they will have inflow of currency of other countries as well as a gold. But the countries which were in the trade deficit, they would eventually decrease the demand just to make sure that they reach the equilibrium point, and so that the gold and silver, or in this case the gold, shall not leave their country. So that was the origin where the first time we had a gold standard, and we were able to pledge one currency against the gold as a reference price. This gold standard was making a sense as well, because there was somehow some guarantee in terms of that every note that was printed, at the back of it there was some gold, so there was no worry or no issue that the currency will lose its value and simultaneously it will be devalued, or it would be not of any use. So there was a guarantee behind it. So the great stand of the gold standard was that it contained a powerful mechanism for achieving balance of trade equilibrium by all countries. In the initial stages, we saw that the gold standard worked quite well from 1870s until 1940s. 1940s, it was the time of the First World War. So it was used till that time, but many governments financed their World War One expenditures by printing more money and created inflation in their country because they needed to pay for the equipments or warheads and arms and ammunitions and so on. So they had to pay, and once they paid, they printed more money. It resulted in a great inflation in their countries, and simultaneously the value of their currency decreased. However, we fixed it against the gold, so it became a huge issue for the other countries to accept that specific currency. So due to which the people lost their confidence in the system. However, it remained in practice till the World War II, and eventually the gold standard was dead. And when the gold standard was dead, during the at the start of the World War II, the countries remained idle during that time period, and then after the end of World War II, they needed some other system because the international trade had to take place. How they can go forward, what was their way forward? So for that, they come up with another mechanisms, had a great discussions, and finally eventually in 1944 they were able to come up with another solution, which is discussed later. Now, as we discussed in the previous slide, the countries required some another mechanism for their international trade, and also to make sure that there is a proper monetary system to govern the international trade and currency exchange rate, etc. So in 1944, 44 countries representatives met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and they discussed possibilities and eventually came up with a new solution known as International Monetary System. This was as a response to the collapse of a gold standard, which was no longer acceptable to anyone. So to ensure economic growth that was affected due to the Second World War. Now they wanted to go back to their lives and strengthen their system, their trades, and their businesses, productions, and so on. So they come up with a new mechanism. Now, what was that system that was newly agreed upon and developed? Under this new arrangement, a fixed exchange rate system was established for the first time. Now, fixed exchange rate system we already discussed in the previous slides. And second, all currencies were fixed to gold, but only the US dollar was directly convertible to gold. This means that the value of the currencies of every current country was fixed to gold. That means it was equivalent to some amount of the gold. However, the only currency that could be converted actually to gold was US dollar. Now this means that if you take Pakistani rupee and you say that this is actually equal to this amount of gold, it is understandable. But if you want to convert it into the gold, you cannot convert it. Similar was with the rest of the currencies of the whole world. However, there was only one currency that was directly convertible to the gold, was US dollar. Third, devaluation could not be used for competitive purposes. This means that no country can devalue their currency just because they want to compete in the market and they want to take all the competition out of the market, international market, because their currency is devalued or it has given a less value so that its conversion rate does not affect the international market and they get more business out of the international trade. Lastly, the country could not devalue its currency by more than 10% without IMF approval. Now here we will discuss that due to this particular agreement in the Bretton Woods, two institutions were established. One was IMF, which stands for International Monetary Fund, and the second was the World Bank. The task of IMF was to maintain an order in the international monetary system, and the World Bank would promote general economic development throughout the world. It would be of immense importance to understand that these two institutions that was established as a result of Bretton Woods, IMF and World Bank, they were given different tasks. The IMF first task was to bring discipline in terms of exchange rate components. Fixed exchange rate that we discussed in the previous slide was imposed. And due to that fixed exchange rate, it puts a brake on a competitive devolution and brings stability to the world trade environment because every currency value has been fixed and nobody can exploit it. Secondly, the fixed exchange rate regime imposes monetary discipline on countries. So they are doing it in discipline. That means nobody was allowed to print excessive currency. No one was forced to bring inflation, or they were not allowed to increase their money supply into the market because it would affect the competitiveness of the market. The second component is of flexibility. Although the monetary discipline was central objective of the agreement, it was recognized that the rigid policy of fixed exchange rate would be too inflexible because over the period of time you understand that the economic condition of one country is not similar or it does not remain same for a longer run. There would be a probability to break down just like a gold standard. So in some cases a country attempts to reduce its money supply growth and correct a persistent balance of payment deficit could force a country into recession and create a high unemployment. Now, in order to protect the countries from going into the recession or depression, two major features of IMF were to foster the flexibility. That is that IMF would lend facilities and adjustable parties. It indicates that IMF would help the country from coming out of the recession and unemployment phase by giving them some monetary facilities for a shorter period of time so that the country can get back into the balance of payment and they can come out of that specific deficit. For that, a pool of funding was also imposed that every particular member country will contribute into the IMF fund, and that fund would be utilized to help the countries in overcoming their short-term deficits in their balance of payment. So the countries were to be allowed to borrow a limited amount from IMF without adhering any specific agreement. This system was adjustable parties allowed for a devaluation of the currency of a specific country by more than 10% if the IMF agreed upon it. So the member countries were not allowed to drastically decrease or increase their currency value. Rather, they can do it to the maximum of 10% fluctuation in their value of their currency, and above it was based on the agreement or acceptance by the IMF if they allowed. So the country may go for more devaluation of their currency, otherwise they were not allowed. The second institution that was established because of the Bretton Woods Agreement was World Bank. Now, the fundamental task of World Bank was decided to promote general economic development throughout the globe. It's also called International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Now, if you see most of the activities of the World Bank, it is for the development, for the reforms, for the improvement of the government mechanism, and for the development of the human workforce of the countries. In the very first slide on the start of this lecture, we discussed that IMF is preferring and forcing, convincing countries to go for the floating exchange rate. There is a reason, and the reason is presented in this particular slide over here. It was because of the collapse of fixed exchange rate system in the market. Internationally, the fixed exchange rate that we discussed previously was in place and it was functioning well till 1960s. However, in 1973, it completely collapsed. And since then, we have had managed float system. It collapsed when a huge increase in welfare programs and the Vietnam War were financed by increasing the money supply and causing significant inflation in the US and allies countries. Other countries increased the value of their currencies relative to the US dollar. In response to speculation, the dollar would be devalued because the more you print the currency, it gets devalued. However, because the system relied on economically well managed US, when the US began to print the money, run high trade deficit and experiences high inflation, the system was strained to breaking point. The US dollar came under speculative attack because if you remember, it was only the US currency, that is the US dollar, which was allowed to directly convert into the gold. Now, as a result or the speculations that were in the market that the US dollar would be devalued, what happened that people started purchasing German Deutschmarks, the currency for their exchange rate, and it was becoming more acceptable currency for US trade and for the international trade as well. On a single day in 1971, the Central Bank of Germany had to buy over 1 billion US dollars to hold the dollar and the German currency exchange rate at its fixed rate, given the great demand for the German currency. On the exchange trading at the point, the German central bank faced an inevitable and allowed its currency to float freely. So in the weeks following the decision to float the German currency, as the foreign exchange market become increasingly convenient that the dollar would be or would have to be devalued. However, the devaluation of the dollar was not an easy matter. because under the agreement of Bretton Woods, any other currency would change its exchange rate against all currencies simply by fixing its dollar rate to a new level. But as the key currency in the system, the dollar could be devalued only if all currencies agreed simultaneously revalue against the US dollar. So the many countries did not want this because they did not want their currency to be devalued. It was just the US currency, the US dollar, which was getting devalued because of the excessive printing and because it would make their products more expensive relative to the US product. So the force the issue, President Nixon announced in August 1971 that the dollar was no longer convertible to gold. Now remember, in 1944 it was decided that the only currency which was convertible to gold is now in 1971 no longer convertible to the gold. So he also announced that the new 10% tax on import would remain in effect until US trading partners agreed to revalue their currencies against the US dollar. So eventually he was forcing all other countries to revalue and reevaluate their currency against the US dollar. This brought the trading partners to the bargaining table, and in December 1971 an agreement was reached to devalue the dollar by about 8% against foreign currency. The import tax was then removed. So that the problem was not solved yet. However, the US balance of payment position continued to deteriorate throughout 1973, and while the nation's money supply continued to expand at the inflationary rate, speculation continued to grow that the dollar was still overvalued and that the second devaluation would be necessary. In this anticipation, the foreign exchange dealers began converting US dollar once again to the German currency and other currencies as well. So after a massive wave of speculation in February 1973, with the European central banks spending $3.6 billion on March 1 to try to prevent their currencies from appreciating against the dollar, the foreign exchange market was eventually closed. The Bretton Woods system had to collapse. The system could not work if its key currency, the US dollar, was under speculative attack. So, this could work only as long as the US inflation rate remained low and the United States did not run into the balance of payment deficit. Once these things occurred, the system soon became strained and to the breaking point. This was the point where they realized that we can no longer operate under the fixed exchange rate system, and now we have to allow the market forces to determine the exchange rate price. So eventually a floating exchange rate was adopted, and that was the reason that the fixed exchange rate in 1970 stopped. Now, because that the fixed exchange rate was no longer acceptable to the member states of IMF, it was a high time to meet and come up with an alternative mechanism to operate the international monetary system. So in 1976, the member states met in Jamaica and agreed to the rules for international monetary system, which are in place and in practice today as well. So a new exchange system was established in 1976. The rules that were agreed on are still in place today under the Jamaica Agreement. These were some of the major agreements that took place. First, floating rates were declared acceptable. All the member countries of IMF were permitted to enter the foreign exchange market to even out unwarranted speculative fluctuations. Thus, they declared floating rates acceptable. Second important agreement was that gold was abandoned as a reserve asset. Previously, whenever the US as a country printed $1, they used to keep a equivalent value in gold in reserve. So now this system agreed that there is no longer need to keep a gold as a reserve asset against printing a currency. The IMF returned its gold reserve to members at the current market price, which was kept with IMF, and placing the proceeds in trust fund to help poor nations. IMF members were permitted to sell their own gold reserves at the market price as well. Third, total annual IMF quota. The amount member countries contribute to IMF were increased to $41 billion. Since then, they have been increased to 767 billion, while the membership of the IMF has been expanded to include 188 countries, which includes non-oil exporting, less developed countries, were given fund access, and IMF since then is giving their funds or in the form of the loan or support to different developing countries to improve their economic situation and also to help them come out of their balance of payment deficits. Since 1973, we have seen different phases of which are of interest because there has been several ups and downs in the exchange rate since 1973. Since 1973, the exchange rate have been more volatile and less predictable. People cannot predict what would happen next, and there was an era that was post World War II till 1973, because people could predict what will happen to the exchange rate because there was a fixed exchange rate mechanism in practice. However, we have seen different breakthroughs and also some of the major ups and downs in the market since then. For example, in 1971 there were oil crises, and it was the time when OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was having a quadrupled the oil prices. A harmful effect of this was on the once again on the US inflation rate, and the trade position resulted in a further decline in the value of a dollar. Then we saw that people started to lose their confidence in the US currency between 1977 and 1978 because of US inflation. Then suddenly, in between 1980s and 1985, the US dollar gained the trust, and the price, conversion price in the international market was rising. That was because of several reasons. The US was expanding their businesses and so on. Then once again, we saw a partial collapse of EMS in 1992, which was the European monetary system, and this collapse resulted in so many issues, and eventually they have to come up with their own mutually agreed currency, that was a euro. Then 1997 and onwards, we saw an Asian currency crisis as well. Asian currencies of several countries, including Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, lost between 50 to 80% of its value against the US dollar, and that was too very abruptly. And then once again, the decline in 2008 to 10 was witnessed, which was the era where the US dollar lost its value. This was also evident because of the global financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis of the European Union during the 2010 and 11. So now that we are operating, or most of the countries are operating on floating exchange rate, there are several ups and downs, but these ups and downs are basically directly based on the performance of that country in the international trade. Now that we know about the gold standard, we discussed the establishment of a fixed system exchange rate, and then moving towards the floating exchange rate. A question arises, which one is better, because most of the countries are still operating, some are operating on the floating exchange rate, whereas there are certain countries which follow fixed exchange rate system even today. Floating exchange rate provides monetary policy autonomy. It is very important to understand that this autonomy is basically a market-driven mechanism where the market forces decides on what should be the price depending on the demand and supply. So the country's ability to expand or contract its money supply as it sees fit is limited by the need to maintain exchange rate parity. Money expansion can lead to inflation, which puts downward pressure on the fixed exchange rate. Similarly, the monetary contraction requires high interest rates. Higher interest rates lead to the inflow of money from abroad, which puts upward pressure on the fixed exchange rate. Thus, to maintain the exchange rate parity under the fixed system, countries were limited in their ability to use monetary policy to expand or contract their economies. Advocates of the floating exchange rate regime argue that removal of the obligation to maintain exchange rate parity would restore monetary control to the government. If the government faced uh, with unemployment, they wanted to increase its money supply to stimulate domestic demands and reduce unemployment. It could do so unencumbered by the need to maintain exchange rate. Now, second, automatic trade balance adjustments are very easy because the country or the government can easily predict their trade surplus or trade deficit based on their imports and exports, and simultaneously can see the demand and supply of different currencies and so on. So the floating exchange rate helps in this regard. But the fixed exchange rate system provides a monetary discipline which is not there, because the government cannot intervene into the floating exchange rate, and it is only the market forces that allow or that determine the currency rate. So one of the element that is positive in the fixed exchange rate is that the government has somewhat their role in determining and controlling the exchange rate. Second, minimize speculations. The government, either by pledging or by dirty floating, they are in a position to ensure that there is no hype in the currency rates and the speculations remain under the control. And it helps in reducing the uncertainty. But however, that speculations also add to the uncertainty surrounding future currency movement and characterizing floating exchange rate regimes. Now, the question here remains the same: which one is better? Because now we know from the historical perspective that the member states, the 44 member states of the Bretton Woods Agreement, they eventually had to give up on the fixed exchange rate and accept the floating exchange rate. However, there are issues with the floating exchange rate because it is not under the control of the government. Yet, we have seen that IMF is forcing its member countries, particularly the countries who has taken loan from IMF or something, they are under the specific force to let the market decide the exchange rate. So both has their own pros and cons, and it depends on the monetary policy of the country and their agreement with the International Monetary Fund that how they can move on. Since 1973, where the member countries of IMF, they decided to move out of the fixed exchange rate system to the floating exchange rate system. Various exchange rate regimes are in practice these days. Now, if you see, 14% of the IMF member countries follow free float policy. This indicates that it is in practice. However, 26% of IMF member states are following managed float system. That they mean they have somehow some influence over deciding the monetary policy and the exchange rate initiative, whereas 22% of members have no legal tender of their own. Now, what does legal tender mean? Legal tender means the banknotes that must be acceptable if offered in payment of a debt or so on. In United States, legal tender for all debts, public charges, taxes and dues, etc. are basically the coins and currencies of United States itself. Foreign gold or silver or any other currency are not tender for debts. Now, there are certain examples where legal tender is not applicable or this is not in function. It includes some of the countries that have adopted dollar as its currency. For example, Ecuador or Panama, etc. Similarly, we witnessed during the Afghan war, Pakistani rupee was a sort of a legal tender to and was used in Afghanistan as a currency which was acceptable for everyone. The main implication for the country to adopt an exchange arrangement with no separate legal tender is that it completely surrenders its control over the monetary policy. Therefore, usually this regime is adopted by the governments that are considered as non-reliable, substituting their currency in favor of a currency of another country considered to be stable and with an effective monetary policy. This we have witnessed in some of the African countries as well as in the case of Afghanistan, while the remaining countries use less flexible system such as peg agreement or adjustable pegs. Countries with a pegged exchange rate system peg their currency or the value of their currency to the another major currency. Particularly in most of the developing countries, they have somehow pegged their currency against US dollar, which was in practice in Pakistan as well. Countries using a currency board commit to converting their domestic currency on demand into another currency at a fixed exchange rate. Therefore, we are also witnessing fixed exchange rate mechanisms in practice in some of the countries even to date. Now, this diagram over here shows what type of exchange rate system is in practice today by the IMF member countries. It includes 6% of the member countries following adjustable peg, 14% are using free float, 28% are using fixed peg, 26% are using managed float, no separate tender is used by 22%, and currency boards are used by 4% of the member countries. Now, what is the role of IMF today? We have seen and witnessed the function of IMF in different perspectives, somehow helping the member countries to come out of their financial crisis and more importantly from their balance of trade deficit, including current deficit and fiscal deficits. Today, IMF mostly focuses on lending monies to the countries in financial crisis, the countries that are at the verge of getting bankrupt. IMF helps them to overcome their financial crisis and improve their current position. Many types of financial crisis are witnessed in which IMF was of help. In particularly, some of the key contributions were the following. First, the currency crisis that emerged in Brazil during 2002. In 2002, Brazil economy was suffering from lingering financial and current account problem. Contagion from the crisis in neighboring Argentina and the prospects that economic policies would be significantly altered after the election. An IMF standby arrangement helped restore confidence and stabilize the economy of Brazil. Low inflation, narrowing income disparities, and reduced poverty are among the many achievements of Brazil in the recent time. So the IMF during the Brazil crisis was able to work and act as a helping hand, where IMF announced a 15-month standby credit of more than 30 billion US dollar to support Brazil's economic and financial program through December 2003. Uh, Brazil economic and financial situation improved significantly following the election. The country's new government pursued policies that were both prudent and courageous, combining fiscal and monetary discipline with critical initiatives to relieve poverty. Then the measuring the impact of IMF on Brazil in overcoming their crisis through a good policy making and sound choices, the IMF contributions was to help restore confidence so that the new government would have time to put in place its policy framework. During 2006, it was stated that consider the fund's risky and creative lending package to Brazil in August 2002 when the markets were terrified and the impending elections of presidential reforms would induce Brazil to cast aside its newly stable macroeconomic policies, with market access suddenly freezing up and the country on the brink of default. The funds stepped in with 30 billion US dollar. The fund's loan arguably helped avert a meltdown that would have slammed global market from Manila to Istanbul and foresettled the bank period that emerging market economies have enjoyed from the past few years. So one of the IMF role was to help in their crisis of Brazil. The second major contribution of IMF was referred to a banking crisis, system banking crisis, or a systematic banking crisis. There are around more than 150 banking crises with more than 200 currency crises and several sovereignty crises. The availability of fiscal and monetary space and ability to finance larger deficit allowed high-income countries to act counter-cyclically to mitigate the impact of the crisis on the real economy. IMF was of help to help in the worst recession during several phases in the different countries, and they were able to create a scenario to restore the economic stability and ensure the growth. Similarly, the foreign debt crisis that emerged in the Greece and Ireland in 2010 and so on in the other countries after that, including the Egypt crisis. Pakistan is an example to it, and several other countries have been reported that IMF has been of help. Not only IMF, but there are different other financial institutions who take measures to support the countries in their financial crisis. However, when the country is having no other option and they are in the severe crisis, IMF is a most trusty platform that the countries go and take help out of. How has the IMF done so far? Well, there is a difference of an opinion. People in our country particularly are divided in their opinions. Some are in favor of IMF and some are against it. Particularly how it has done, it depends on your need and your agreement. Although there is hardly any particular country which is out of the debt of IMF, and IMF is one of the major platforms that the member countries prefer to go when they are facing crisis. However, the terms and conditions of the agreement of the loan and financial aid provided by the IMF, that matters, and it is of the crucial importance. Since 2010, the IMF was making loan to 68 countries, all of which require tight macroeconomic and monetary policies. However, critics worry that IMF is following a concept or mechanism one size fits all approach. That means to them whatever is acceptable in a developed country, it should be similar and similarly acceptable and implemented in developing countries as well. And there is no understanding or going through the country's own requirement and their way of doing business. However, there is a simple and straightforward mechanism, standard operating procedures, and all components which are being enforced or imposed by the IMF on all the countries. Therefore, it is very difficult to ensure that whatever has been acceptable and workable in one country may be workable in the other country as well. Then the IMF is exacerbating moral hazard. Now, it refers to that IMF is making the situation more worse. How it is compounding or making the situation more worse, we have seen it and observed it in the different debates that we see, and the articles are also referring to it as something that is not acceptable or not workable to most of the countries, because it is believed that IMF is not improving the scenario or situation of the country, rather through their tight monetary and fiscal policies, tight control over the components, it is affecting the developing countries instead of improving their situation by imposing different different terms and conditions. Then the IMF has become too powerful for an institution without any real mechanism of accountability. So this is one more criticism, that who is monitoring IMF, because IMF is a body which is not an institution working under any specific country and law. So it has been unleashed without any chains, without any proper mechanism for accountability. This is one of the great criticism it faces. However, in the recent years, the IMF has started to change its policies and becoming more flexible, urge countries to adapt fiscal stimulus and monetary easing policies in response to the global financial crisis. Yet we see that the IMF still needs to work on their policies to make it more easier and convenient, and also make it more customized based on the financial conditions of the country to whom they are lending money. Now, concluding it, being a manager, you need to understand how the monetary system affects your major areas. First, your currency management, because the currency system is managed by the government intervention, or it is based on free float. In either way, there is an influence on exchange rate. So if your currency country is following free float, then you can see there is a sudden increase or decrease in the value of the specific currency. And if it is fixed by the government, once again you will see some figures, some values which are maybe not realistic. Second reason that you need to understand the monetary system is your business strategy, because being an international business, the exchange rate movement can have a major impact on the competitive position of your business. If your currency is devalued, it is going to give you advantage, but if your currency is overvalued, it is going to affect your business. If there is inflation in the country, it is going to affect your business strategy. If there is unemployment in the country, there is an issue or a problem for you. If there are more currency printed, it is going to affect your business strategy, and so on. Lastly, the corporate governance component is very important. Businesses can influence government policies towards the international monetary system, yet the corporate governance systems are very important because the governments are somehow controlling you and your activities through the different corporate governance policies, rules, and regulations.